Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Unpacking Islamophobia. I'm your host, Mubashara Tazamol, and today we're in conversation with Amira Elghawaby, who served as Canada's first special representative on combating Islamophobia between 2023 and 2026. Canada is often viewed as the friendly, welcoming country, especially in comparison to its neighbor, the United States. However, it's important to note that Canada has experienced rising Islamophobia, including a number of violent and deadly attacks. In 2017, the country experienced a Quebec City mosque massacre. And in 2021, there was a deadly hit and run that killed four members of a Muslim family in in London, Ontario. And there were also a spate of Islamophobic hate crimes targeting Black Muslim women in Calgary and Edmonton in 2021 as well. The deadly June 2021 London, Ontario attack actually became the impetus for which the Canadian government established this position of a special representative on combating Islamophobia, making it the first country in the world to do so. So, very historic. Along with hate crimes, there's also been discriminatory legislation, such as Bill 21 in Quebec, and I believe it's currently being heard before the court system in the province. And there's also prejudicial and dangerous rhetoric coming from politicians, and this puts the lives of Canadian Muslims at risk. We previously had Amira on our podcast back in 2023, and three years later, we're here to catch up on her historic position, the positive developments in terms of policies and programs in tackling Islamophobia, the issues of concern that remain, and what she hopes for the Canadian Muslim community moving forward. Amira, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Mubashra, for having me, and just a big thank you to the Bridge Initiative and all the work you're doing to raise awareness, understanding, and allow those who care about these issues to sort of stay on top of it all.
Thank you, Amira. Like I said, you held a very historic position as Canada's first special representative on combating Islamophobia, and it was the first position established by any country in the world. During your time in office, what were some of the most significant lessons you learned about tackling Islamophobia at an institutional, and structural level?
Well, it won't surprise your listeners and viewers to know that the barriers to even building the office within the federal government were not insignificant. I would say that obviously any new institution is going to face challenges, but I really do think that while Canadians understood that Islamophobia could be deadly. In your introduction, Mubashra, you talked about the attacks in Quebec City, where six Quebec Muslim men were shot dead in 2017 by an individual who had been self-radicalized against Muslims, or whether it was 2021, the London attack, that despite all of that, within the federal government and within society, the challenges remained to actually continue to have not just lip service to the need to address Islamophobia, but to actually see action taken. And so, being within the federal government, there were many challenges that were overcome with a lot of, hard work and figuring out how to navigate those types of spaces and relying on allies. I can't overemphasize enough the importance of allies in this work at whatever level people are working at. Certainly within the federal system, it quickly became clear that it wasn't enough to have the mandate. It was really important to have champions at various levels and ideally at high levels within government who could show the way and ensure that the work that we were hoping to do in the office, which was to help influence public policy and correct, where there were misunderstandings or deliberate biases towards our communities, that we would have to be brought into those spaces, even within the federal government, even within a mandate. And so the 3 years really were about building relationships, as they are in many spaces, building relationships, demonstrating what exactly the office was meant to do. And the mandate was very large for anyone who's had a chance, to look at it. It went from providing advice and guidance on hate crimes and how to address the rise in those facing our communities, sadly, whether it was reframing narratives about Canadian Muslims, whether it was raising public awareness, influencing other systemic policies that are impacting, it was such a broad mandate and a fairly small budget. We were initially with just over 1 million, and then it was expanded to just under about around 2 million. Sounds like a lot, but when you are dealing with a country where the communities are 5% of the population, and you're wanting to travel, you're wanting to hear, collect testimonies, help that inform the advice, keeping it very much centered on that community informed policy making and decision making, it was having to do a lot with a little. And so I think that we were able to do a lot with a little. We were able to build relationships. And I think that, from point A, where our community said after the attack on the Afzal family, they're fondly remembered as our London family, they said, look, we need help. And one of the ways is through an office at the federal level. From that point A towards Z, where the office was closed just a short while ago, those 3 years, I think the office did what it needed to do, which was bring more visibility to the crucial urgency of Islamophobia in our country, as well as raise at a critical time as we were watching the genocide in Gaza, the reality of anti-Palestinian racism and anti-Arab racism impacting here at home, how the political rhetoric globally impacted us nationally, and how Canadians, including Canadian Muslims, Palestinians, and Arabs, as well as allies, just trying to express their deep, deep anger about the failure of governments to uphold and defend international law. All of this was under attack in that period of my tenure. And the different types of Islamophobic tropes about our communities were used and weaponized during this period and continue to until now, of course, in order to silence, in order to erase, and to control narratives about what we're seeing and what we're experiencing. And so, right out the bat, the office was clear. Our communities were not going to go back to the immediate post 9/11 era, where we were going to be racially profiled, where we were going to face all sorts of manner of discrimination for actions that had nothing to do with us. And we were going to vociferously defend our rights to speak out, to exercise freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and that we were going to call out Islamophobia, anti-Palestinian racism, anti-Arab racism in the institutions that, for many young people especially, really let them down.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things is just having the position established, um, is the Canadian government recognizing that it's an issue. That is a huge win, I would say, in comparison to, let's say, the UK, where there are still ongoing debates and conversations about even defining Islamophobia. So having the position was a massive recognition for Canadian officials, recognizing this is an issue, this is a problem, this is real. And I'm glad that you mentioned the mandate because it was so vast. And for a very small office, you end up doing, along with media narratives and communications, public awareness and education, you're also responding to events that are happening. And often what happens with Islamophobia is things that happen abroad impact Muslims at home. So the October 7th attacks and the ensuing genocide in Gaza, that had repercussions for individuals around the globe. And obviously, Canadian Muslims expressing their their feelings and their worries and their sadness and anger over what was happening was then weaponized by certain voices. And in an effort to silence them, they were smeared with allegations of anti-Semitism and so on and so forth. So that period that you were in office, so much happened. But I want to note that, like you said, you did amazing things and you were able to implement broad awareness about the issue. And one of the things is that your office published the Canadian Guide to Understanding and Combating Islamophobia. I've used this in my research. I link it whenever I can because it's really, really valuable. It's the first of its kind issued by any government. Can you tell us more about it, what it covers, and who it's primarily aimed at?
Yeah, yeah, for sure, Mubashara. And I'm really happy to hear that you use it. And I really encourage folks to seek it out. It's still available on the Government of Canada's website. Quick Google search and it will come up for you. And it is a very critical resource, I think, to support anyone who needs a reliable place to go for information about what Islamophobia is, what it isn't. We often hear from our detractors, and it was live in the UK during the discussion around the definition that Islamophobia is the effort to shut down criticism of Islam. So, right off the bat within the guide, we make it absolutely clear that you can criticize Islam. That's never been what it's been about. It's always been about addressing the racism, the discrimination, the viewing our communities as a greater security threat than other communities. And we really unpack the way that this form of hatred and discrimination impacts on communities. And really, it's a resource that years ago when I worked as a journalist and then later as an advocate, I wish that I had had. Because I would be, whether it was talking to a newsroom about what Islamophobia is, whether it was speaking to educators and, doing presentations or, public officials or corporate officials, wanting to be able to point to a resource or even utilize it as a reference point was always very challenging. Unfortunately, there's a lot of information out there, but it's in pieces all over the place. And what we were trying to do with this guide and what I think we achieved was really bringing in, of course, we couldn't bring in everything, but bringing in core concepts. So within the guide, we talk about not only hate crimes, which are a form of obviously Islamophobia, and sadly in Canada, as well as I know in the US and other countries, we've seen this very dramatic rise in hate crimes targeting us, even though there's underreporting is an issue. And so we talk about that in the guide, but we also talk about the systemic forms of Islamophobia, the way that it can impact within federal and different kinds of policies. We talk about intersectional forms of Islamophobia. So within the guide, you'll find a discussion of anti-Black racism and how it intersects anti-Palestinian racism, which was a really critical piece to ensure was included in the guide in this moment and the past few years where it became so critical to name it as people were experiencing it. We also go into best practices or good practices from what we've seen across Canada in terms of allyship. We offer, some guidance on what organizations can do, what individuals can do. So it really is meant to provide a fairly good and comprehensive overview, as well as a tool. And, what I often have shared with folks is polling in Canada has shown that nearly half of Canadians have said that they want to be allies to Canadian Muslims. And the same number says they just need more resources. They're just not sure how to do it. So the guide was meant to really support those folks, as well as within those in our communities who, whether they're a parent wanting to speak at a parent council meeting and not really sure, how do they present on this, whether it's someone at their workplace who wants to do a lunch and learn, it really is meant, to be for even the advocate who is meeting with the chief of police. In there we highlighted, for instance, the OSCE guide on hate crimes against Muslim communities and the advice they provide in that excellent document. So it really is meant to be used by folks. And as you said, Mubashara, you're using it, and I have indeed heard people have used it in even grievances in their workplaces when they have faced anti-Palestinian racism. I know, at least several cases who've done so and utilize it to have, a description of what that is and how it impacts. So it has been utilized, and I hope it continues to be so. And I've presented it, at international tables at the Council of Europe, European Commission, as well, and with UN counterparts. So it is widely viewed as, as you mentioned, the first of its kind. And I hope, not the last of its kind, that we would see more governments. I remember presenting it to the Norwegian government, who have an anti-Muslim racism action plan, and they really appreciated the guide. So I hope to see it, utilized, and that other governments, others also initiate their own that can take into consideration local, national contexts as well.
Yeah, I mean, exactly what you said. The resource is a guide. It provides guidance. So not only is it informative and educational, it gives the reader, whether they be an educator, a young person entering the workforce, support and guidance on how to address this issue when they face it, or if they face it, or if they want to educate others on it. And I think that is what's so important about it, but also it's a government document that's historic.
That's right.
Again, so I had mentioned earlier about the UK's ongoing debates about the very definition of Islamophobia. In the US, we have politicians comparing Muslims to dogs, and calling for Muslims to be deported. This is um, kind of the environment of Islamophobia that we're functioning under. Where does Canada stand in comparison? And what meaningful progress has been made at a governmental level? And where do most critical gaps remain?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're seeing, in the UK or the US and here in Canada as well is deeply, deeply troubling. And at times where there is war, conflict, lead ups to elections where our communities are scapegoated, and used to win popular support by certain parties. All of this creates a very dangerous climate for our communities, actually. And what happens in the US, for instance, or the UK, impacts us here in Canada. The killer in Quebec City, it was 2 days after Donald Trump had put together the so-called Muslim ban, and had presented that. And then our former prime minister tweeted out, Canada was a place that would welcome people from around the world who are fleeing war and violence, and that was what we stood for standing up for people. And that's what actually set the killer off. And made him decide to go and, shoot indiscriminately into the mosque that night. And so, we are all interconnected, and he had seen what others had done. Of course, we had the 2011 the terrorist attack in Norway, where the killer there was also very much motivated by anti-Muslim hatred and racism, and then there was Christchurch. So we have all of these sad and horrific and tragic examples of people who are motivated to do heinous, heinous acts of violence because of their hatred towards our communities. So this game of us versus them, that some politicians play to different levels, is absolutely dangerous. And here in Canada, we're seeing less of that. And it is, I believe, because we've had the highest number of deadly deliberate killings of Muslims of any G7 country, if you look at the years 2017 to 2021. And so um, it was not after, in fact, the first massacre in Quebec City that we actually had consensus politically that we had to combat Islamophobia. It took the second massacre for all political parties to finally use the term Islamophobia, at least at the federal level, and acknowledge that it is a danger and a threat to our communities, to democracy itself, and stand behind efforts to combat it. And that has really been what has, I believe, um, been important for our communities who, and I've been working in this field, as I mentioned, as a journalist, but then since 2012 as an advocate. And I can tell you, it has been a very hard journey to get to the point where we are now, where we did have an office at the federal level to combat Islamophobia, where there remains a commitment from the federal government to address Islamophobia. Um, and again, it is really sad to say that it is because of the loss of life and the mobilizing power of Canadian Muslims to
Mhm.
present recommendations to the federal government at a summit that was held shortly after the killings in London, Ontario, where hundreds of recommendations were made to all levels of government, including the creation of the office. So where we are now, as I said, is the federal government remains, at least has said it remains committed to Islamophobia. And so, the communities and Canadians will judge that going forward. And there seems to be interest to continue and to recognize that it remains an issue and a problem that needs to be addressed. And as I said, it affects democracy, it affects our freedoms, our rights, it affects all people. And not to forget that there are international obligations for freedom of religion, for freedom of expression, for the protection of minorities. And Canada is a signatory to all of this. So there is a responsibility as well to ensure that this is all, taken very seriously. Again, not just in word, but in deed.
Yeah. I think it is positive that positive things have happened in response to such horrible tragedies, and the government and all of political parties and Canadians in general recognize that there was a problem and there is a problem and the need to address it. It's unfortunate that loss of life is what got, I guess, people to wake up. And here in the UK, I would say we're like simmering. We're at some sort of boiling point where Islamophobia from politicians is so rampant. And then it's on social media, and we've had incidences of mosque vandalization that have increased. We have increased hate crimes, and there is a real fear that there can be some sort of mass attack because along with the constant Islamophobic rhetoric and demonization, you have people who are very angry with the cost of living and they're looking for someone to
Right.
blame. And politicians utilize these fears for their own political gain by scapegoating Muslims and saying, well, they're the reason apparently why you can't pay your bills. So I hope other countries and politicians look towards Canada to not wait for some mass tragedy to happen, for them to take this issue seriously. But it is, in comparison, I do think the Canadian government has taken uh, measurable actions in terms of combating Islamophobia. Um, Going through what I just described of, we're living through a moment when Islamophobia appears to have just reached unprecedented levels worldwide.
Yes.
What advice would you offer to policymakers, young professionals working in this space, and anyone who's concerned about the issue and wants to make a difference? What advice would you offer them, especially for those wanting to work within the governmental sector?
hmm Well, Mubashara, you actually put your finger on something really critical as well. You talked about sort of the economic climate that we find ourselves in, and in fact, as you said, this is sadly, a very prime moment where scapegoating, where othering of minority communities becomes so dangerous and so much more common. And we, in fact, do talk about that in the guide. We talk about the drivers of Islamophobia, including economic. And also, we talked about, which is relevant to what you were saying, the Islamophobia industry. So, when I do presentations, whether it's to federal officials, whether it's to, the public or private sector, I talk about the fact that on the one hand, Islamophobia, like all forms of hatred and discrimination, exist, and that we have to tackle them. We have to tackle all forms, anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, anti-Semitism. The list is very long. These types of hatreds, they're all really need to be addressed. Anti-Indigenous discrimination, racism, which is an issue here for us here in Canada that we have to address. And so that is all true. What is unique, however, for Islamophobia is that there is a monetized industry, number one, and number two, that there is also foreign interference. So, in fact, we highlighted in the guide that in 2024, the Canadian government had to ask questions to the Israeli government when reports emerged that there was an Israeli agency that was involved in spreading Islamophobic social media content here in Canada. So these are elements that add to this danger that anyone who's interested in advocating or speaking about these topics or getting to know them, that has to be really front of mind, is that it's not just everyday, lack of awareness or ignorance, or, what I often worry about is, when I'm at the grocery store and someone who just has never met a Muslim, and the only impression is what they see on the news, and I can understand, okay, they're going to perhaps have some biases that they're going to carry when they interact with me, and hopefully a smile and a kind word will address it. No, there is much more to it. And in fact, I often use a case out of Newmarket, which is near Toronto here in Canada, where there was a neighbor to a Muslim family. They were neighbors for 14 years. And the neighbor confided to another neighbor that, as a HVAC expert, he had made a plan to bomb his neighbor's home, killing the family and the children, and had a plan to bomb the local mosque they attended. This is after knowing each other for 14 years and having a decent relationship, as neighbors do. And this individual was indeed radicalized online. And so that is something that we have to keep front of mind, that what is happening online, and Canada does not have yet online harms legislation. So as they often say, it's the wild, wild west online, and I know in the US it's similar. There was an excellent study or short brief from the Center on the Study of Organized Hate, for instance, that you probably saw, many of your viewers probably saw it, but they were documenting the Islamophobic hate on X, on formerly Twitter, between February 28th to March 5th. And they, located over 29,000 posts that were magnified 11-fold, reaching, over 200 and maybe 60,000 accounts, but and impressions, in the millions. And these were posts that they thematically organized where, as you talked about, Muslims need to be deported, denaturalized, they're pests, they're vermin, they need to be destroyed, exterminated. These are the narratives, and they are not solely seen in the US, they are seen globally. And when they try to report even a small group of these, only a third were taken down. 2/3 of that hateful content remained on the platform. So the influence of online hate cannot be undermined. But by the same token, and sort of the message of hope that I give myself and I share with others, is that more and more people globally, according to the Edelman Trust Barometer, are finding faith and trust within their local communities, within their local neighborhoods. And so while we have to be aware of how people are consuming this kind of content, we also have to know that there's a potential for a lot of good work to happen at the local level, at municipalities, in our communities. And there are folks who are working, I know, at ENAR and in Europe, on, collecting good practices across municipalities there of what's happening. There are, other networks, big cities and, networks looking at different ways to counter hate at local levels. So the good news for those on this call with us or on this webinar here, for them to recognize that what they do at the local level can have a very, very big impact, and perhaps the most significant impact when we look at the big picture here and when we feel how daunting it all is.
Yeah, it is such a massive problem when you think about it because there's a transnational element to it. We talk
That's right.
about the Islamophobia industry, it is a transnational industry
Right.
with revenues of billions. There's been multiple studies, one from Professor Jasmine Zine at Wilfrid Laurier University, estimating that there's billions to be made in propagating Islamophobia, especially online, where social media currency is the new thing right now, being an influencer, monetizing your content. Um,
That's right.
but you mentioned of starting at the local level, and I think that is something really important. Our previous guest in the podcast episode we just had was Taj Ali, who's a British historian and journalist here in the UK. And he emphasizes constantly on working at a local level. He talks about working class, and he often says, the kind of imagery we have when we talk about working class is the white working class, but let's not forget you know, brown, black, there it's a working class is everyone, and we all have the same concerns. And he looks specifically at his home city of Luton, which is where Tommy Robinson is actually from. Um,
Hmm.
and there's documentaries that he's done with The Guardian that I advise everyone to watch because they're very good at a human level. And he speaks to people in the town and what their concerns are, and they recognize that they're being fed hatred. And at the same time, they're saying, I can't pay my bills. I can't afford the electricity. Gas prices are crazy. And so there's real grievances at a local level. And if there's a community sort of solidarity and network that comes together, recognizing, your neighbors, that can have in just even a minimal way of blockading that constant hate that you open your phone and you see, you turn the TV on and you see. So, yeah, on a very local and human level, getting to know one another and supporting one another and recognizing that we've all got the same concerns.
Hmm.
But again, not erasing the fact that this is a powerful machinery on a global level, and efforts need to be made to tackle the hatred from the top down.
That's right. No, that's absolutely true, Mubashara. And I think what is so key for listeners to the podcast are also thinking about and viewers is that um, to your point, at the local level, there are grievances. And so not only should we be engaged around the topic of Islamophobia, if anything,
Yeah.
we need to engage around addressing and advocating for, ensuring that there isn't this huge divide in class, that we address the economic turmoil that many of our societies are facing, and we can engage, for example, with the union movements, the labor movements. And I know their weekend, I was very involved with the Canadian Labor Congress here in Canada. Their union membership is not where it once was. However, unions still are and can be the largest social movements in countries. And within many unions, there is a significant recognition of how race and faith and all of these different identities are used to create divisions and allow those who are making, a lot of money off of our backs, how they are utilizing these divisions, pitting us against one another, keeping us distracted from the broader conversation and the broader policy change that is needed, which is, of course, ensuring fair taxation, ensuring that workers' rights are respected and upheld, that people can make a decent living, doing one job versus this gig economy, where people are struggling to make ends meet and are running in a rat race that they'll never win, the way that it's set up, and how, powerful parties that speak in a working class way, but actually implement policies that take from the poor to give to the rich. That's a whole discussion, but it is actually central when you think about racism and hatred and discrimination and the role of the state, and the role that the state has to message the unity and the importance of diversity in strengthening our collective, but also the responsibility to create fair societies where everyone has a fair shake, and where everyone pays their fair share. So this really is also at the heart of what matters, and our communities have to be engaged on those issues. And it's often said, of course we want to advocate for ourselves, and we should, but we also have to stand with other oppressed communities. Here in Canada, reconciliation with Indigenous communities is very critical and important, and Muslims should be at the forefront of that, as they should be at the forefront of climate action, as they should be at the forefront of, again, poverty and inequality. These are principles within our faith tradition, and as we build these solidarities, not just because it's a good thing to do, it's the right thing to do, and it's part of our duty as responsible members of our countries, our societies. So we need to be everywhere all at once, and that seems like a lot. So for each person, listening or watching the podcast, they should be thinking about, where am I most able to contribute, and then do that really, really well. And where you don't have time and maybe money, support financially. And where you don't have either, well, just send the good vibes. Send the good
Yeah.
vibes and share this podcast, share the Bridge Initiative, share the guide. There's always something, repost a really good post that you see. There's always something we can do.
Yeah, raising awareness is something everyone can engage in. And like, you just mentioned, there are resources out there, there are organizations out there that are providing those resources that you can use
Mm.
and you can share with others. Um, so in recent news in early February, the government announced that it was shutting down your office along with the Office of the Special Envoy on Combating Anti-Semitism. It's replacing both with a broader Rights, Equality, and Inclusion Advisory Council to address racism and hate more generally. At a time of heightened Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, what was your reaction to the decision, and what message do you think it sends to vulnerable communities?
Well, I was very surprised by the decision of the federal government to close the office. I had a year left in the mandate, and certainly was very eager to continue doing the important work we'd undertaken. For instance, we had started to do some really serious, deep work within government on the issues raised by Canadian Muslim charities as it relates to potential bias and discrimination that they experienced and say they experienced through the one of our agencies on taxation. And so we have been working on it for over a year and a half. It's a very complicated topic, and it's exactly the kind of work that I actually signed up for. That really important, meticulous, follow the thread within a federal system of where are the issues and how can we help. And we had gotten not only commitments from the previous prime minister, but even the current prime minister that this was a priority to address. And so I was looking forward to helping sort of not necessarily solve it, but help the government solve this issue, as many other topics that we were working on. So, I'm at least on that vein. I know that people are still going to continue, academics and experts that we worked with will continue the work, and that's a good thing. And I hope the government will fulfill its commitment on that particular issue. And so surprise. And I think that for many community members and organizations, uh, there was expressions of disappointment with this decision. And I think the impact that we had in the 3 years was such that certainly folks expressed a sense of loss. That closing this office was closing a critical part of the federal government that had created a bridge between these vulnerable communities that are anxious, that continue to be worried about their safety. There isn't, a week that doesn't go by that there isn't someone who is harassed or, experiences violence, or an organization that's not vandalized or receives threats. It's unfortunately very common. And that only speaks again to the hate aspect, let alone the discrimination that people are feeling in their workplaces or in employment and in housing and in very various areas in social life. So there is certainly that disappointment. And I would say as well, Quebec Muslims who are currently experiencing, and for the past several years, Quebec Muslim women in particular, who have been barred from various professions because of their hijab, because of secularism laws that take secularism to a place where many people don't believe it should go, which is not being remaining neutral, but in fact preventing the provincial residents from exercising their freedom of expression and freedom of religion, to wear hijab or a kippah or a turban in certain professions, and now is being expanded to even ban the ability for people to pray in schools or universities, ban even parent volunteers from going with their kids on a school trip if they wear religious clothing. I mean, it's gone very far. And communities there felt that, having this office where I was able to speak to the impact that that has on religious freedom in our country. Again, that is one more loss at a particular level of someone vocalizing their day-to-day reality and how it's impacting them. So, I'm nevertheless proud of what we were able to accomplish in this office for 3 years. As you said, it was the first of its kind anywhere in the world. The news of the office made international headlines, and I think gave a lot of people a lot of hope. And despite its closure, I think people are still carrying that. And one thing that just warms my heart is when I meet, in particular, young people, and in particular, young women who, come up to me and just say thank you. And I've heard that from people of all ages, but it's the young people that I really wanted them to feel that in Canada, despite all that we've been discussing, they can fully belong here. And I, in fact, dedicated my annual report last year to the young people of, the young Canadian Muslims, to tell them that no one should ever take that away from them, and that we have the privilege of living in a country like Canada that does have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, does have human rights codes, has these at least this promise of being a place where everyone can contribute and be who they are. And it's not always kept, as I've just mentioned, but at least we have the language and we have the general support of the population to be able to articulate this and generally receive an audience. And so I'm hopeful, and I think the office energized people at a time where many of us were absolutely devastated by what was happening globally and continue to be devastated by what's happening globally.
Mm. And I think what your office did and what you did is you are the original source of institutional memory on this issue. Your the first of its kind, the work that you've done, raising awareness that you've done serves now as a blueprint, as a foundation for which others can come in and build upon it. I think one thing to note is just because a formal office has closed doesn't mean that the voice of Canadian Muslims is no longer there. Canadian Muslims are still present in the country. There are organizations doing work. And your office helped establish a foundation for which they can continue building on and push for. Look, it was the outcry from a horrible tragedy that led to the establishment of the position. That means there is power in the community, there is a voice, and it doesn't mean that it's just gone away. Um, some Canadian Muslims may have interpreted the closure of the office as a signal that the government does not prioritize anti-Muslim racism. What would you say to them? And more broadly, what advice do you give and do you have for the Canadian Muslim community when it comes to ongoing engagement with the government on this issue? What does meaningful involvement look like, and why does it matter?
Mhm. Mubashira, I think that what I've been saying to folks is, and it may sound a bit cheesy, but it's true. Like all of us are representatives, and we're all special, and we all have the power to make change in our spaces at different levels. And so, I think that right now, um, the federal government has many, many preoccupations. We have the situation with the United States, as many people know, and that is a great, great preoccupation for this government, understandably. The economic, all of these impacts are front and center for Canadians. I think the important thing for our communities is to understand that we have to continue to articulate our experiences to members of parliament, to members of provincial parliament, to city councils. We have to remain present. And as I said, on all issues that matter and impact our lives, and whatever moves you, be involved, get engaged. I often share, for example, when there's a board position that's open at a local community center or community organization, I try to share it within our communities. There are incredible folks. We've got medical professionals, as you know, and I'm sure that I know the situation in the UK. And the UK, they're doing phenomenal work to raise the awareness on the contributions of British Muslims. Similarly, in Canada, medical professionals, engineers, academics, journalists, artists, tradespeople, entrepreneurs, the whole gamut. And all of those folks, lawyers, everything. And all of those folks have spheres of influence and places where they can take on positions of authority and support, initiatives. So I always encourage people that, take the opportunity that you can, if you're able, to be involved. And with regards to the federal government in particular, either get involved in discussion with your own member of parliament, make sure they know your name.
Mm.
And if you don't have the time, and it is a privilege to be able to do that kind of work, do your best to support even in a little bit the organizations that do. And there are many organizations, I won't list them all here, but Canadian Muslims know who they are. There are many organizations that are doing phenomenal work and doing their best, and they need ongoing support. And what I will say is that now, as I look to what I'm going to do next, I hope to continue also to help support our communities still going further. I'm not going anywhere. There are a lot of gaps. There's a lot of gaps in understanding the research that does exist about our communities and using evidence to help inform our advocacy, using evidence to impact media discourse so people understand what we're going through. There are gaps. And that's something that I recognized throughout the 3 years of my tenure. And now going forward, I'm hoping to look at opportunities to create, more institutional support for how do we fill those gaps? How do we empower Canadian Muslims, and in fact, Muslims anywhere, to be able to really utilize the information that we do have, that researchers are gathering, academics like yourself, Mubashira, are really digging into. How do we amplify? How do we translate your work into ways that we can ensure that decision makers, public opinion makers understand and it can resonate and can help affect change? that's where I'm going to start and have been starting to focus my attention. So stay tuned as to how that shapes up. But this is an area of great need, I see. And anyone who's interested can also reach out to me because I'm looking for all the ideas and all the insights and all the collaborations to, again, empower our communities to keep going. Because, again, all we're asking for is human dignity. All we're
Mm.
asking for is human rights. And if any group in a society is not afforded their rights, you can better believe that that democracy is weak and that harms everyone.
Amir, that's such a wonderful way to end this because it gives me hope in terms of moving forward. Often when we discuss Islamophobia, it is such a heavy topic. Um, it seems massive, it seems huge, it seems almost, well, it is daunting at times. But I think exactly as you've laid out of there are gaps, there are skills we have within the community. Everyone can play a part in it. I think everyone has their own unique skills that they can bring to the table in addressing this issue, in highlighting this issue, and it comes social media. You can use social media to highlight this issue in new and innovative ways. And it's a nice way to kind of wrap up the conversation that we've had because we started that the office was established following a horrendous tragedy, and we've ended with, well, look at everything that you've done. Look at the foundations that you've put in place. Look at the guide that's been established. Your office has become a resource for individuals like myself, for academics, and for practitioners across the globe. So Canada has been historic in that effort as well. And moving forward, I'm so interested to hear what you have planned. And I know that Canadian Muslims will continue being engaged and continuing to represent their community and the entire Canadian community in terms of the issues that are of concern to everyone. And like you said, Islamophobia impacts Muslims, but it will impact society as a whole because it deeply um, tears at social cohesion. It infringes on people's human, civil rights, everything. So that's why the topic is so important. Thank you again. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been so nice to have this reflection and learn more about what you are currently working on. For our viewers, please, and listeners, please stay tuned for the next episode and do follow Bridge. Check out our work. Our website is bridge.georgetown.edu. Thank you so much for listening and take care. Bye.
Thank you so much, Mubashara. Bye.